Here we are with Chapter 2 of Bodies and Evidence, this chapter entitled Permission to Speak. Oops. There we go. Okay. So in this chapter, they consider how victim speech during testimony is not just a question of content. So content matters, of course, but significantly, it's about the protocols that shape legal storytelling. They say these stories are not freely told narratives. Rather, they're modeled and restricted to fit the adversarial interactional process in a court of law or legal domination and discursive subordination. Now, this, of course, is not unique to courts of law. We see this kind of thing, for example, with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Fiona Ross has written about this in the South African context, about how the legal or quasi-legal setting of testimony shapes the testimony and in certain ways also then shapes the testifier. You could say produces them as a particular kind of subject. So in that context, you might see that someone who might think of herself as having been a contributor to rebellion is positioned rather as simply a victim, and that's what the constraints of testimony require. So we'll see not the same thing here, but we'll see, because of course it's a different setting, but we'll see that there are similar kinds of forces at work. In this way then, storytelling has, in the court setting, this confessional structure in which victims have permission to speak, but only according to conditions and models of interpretation set by others. In this way, then, the structuring of testimony is individual in one way. Of course, there's only one person on the stand giving testimony, but also the victim is positioned with respect to racialized, gendered, classed, and age-based collectivities. So it's not simply individual, that there's also a collective aspect to it. Oops. Okay, here we go. Caught up. The ambition of the chapter then is not to emphasize the harms of sexual assault, in that they don't spend a lot of time describing assaults, but rather the suffering that the course process itself imposes on victim testifiers. They frame testimony and the structuring of testimony within the larger historical cultural context of distrust of Black women's and girls' accounts of their own lives. So in the three cases that they explore, they find all the same that the testimony of sexual assault survivors rarely conformed to these dominant discourses or the nomos of rape in any straightforward way. Now, sequencing the cases the way that they do allows readers to, quote, note how the court projected and reproduced expectations about the socialization of women and men into mores of sexual consent and trauma across the life course. The affect, self-presentation, and interpretive reality of a credible victim varied based on how cultural norms and collectivities were attached to race and age. Three testifiers, then the three that they address here, showed a range of affect, but they did so against the backdrop of this kind of double bind. There's the stereotyped expectation of the emotionally compromised and visibly upset feminized subject, a stereotype that assigns criteria of credibility to a victim testifier who shows suffering, that simultaneously invalidate her testimony as emotionally overwrought. This is the double bind. You must express suffering and dismay, but that your expression of suffering and dismay invalidates your testimony. Prosecutors, not surprisingly, were familiar with these stereotypes, and their efforts to manage them produced scripts for testifiers. Again, something not completely at variance with what we see in the case of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These scripts, however, varied by victims' age, not specifically of what they had to say, but how to say it, right? So that the scripts were not saying this is what you must say, but rather this is how you should say it. They go on. By focusing on the testimony of Leah, Mary, and Maya, we want to present a picture not only of the ranges of affects and various forms of vulnerability they embody, but also the juridical protocols required for legal storytelling. They captured the expectations for victim testifiers like this. The Judicial Act necessitated establishing blame for sexual assault and therefore required the victim not only to recall past events accurately, but to exemplify an innocent passive victim. In the cases we observed, victims were expected to demonstrate and perform trauma in the present in front of the court. With the adolescent victim, Leah, and the adult, Mary, there is an expectation that they could recount their sexual assaults linearly. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, and remain composed during the testimony. For Maya, the child witness, the expectations of linear recollection were not present. We'll see also that the notion of remaining composed is kind of a double-edged sword, as I've been saying. So with Leah. Now, Leah cried during testimony. This is the adolescent. Cried during testimony, needing breaks to recover herself. And the defense counsel, again, not entirely surprisingly, this is the job of the defense counsel, tried to capitalize on that, invoking the myth that a real victim would recall everything vividly and not have this kind of choppy testimony that Leah, in her distraught state, produced. In a revealing moment, the defense counsel also brought up a lie that Leah told the police, that the defendant had hit her during the assault, in order to discredit her, say, she's a liar. What this might show, though, is her awareness of the kinds of myths surrounding sexual assault. They say she revealed that she lied about being hit by Harris because she feared her complaint would not be taken seriously by the police without physical violence. Oh, sorry. So I was trying to frame all this by saying that Leah's case opens then with the double bind of victim authenticity, turning on highly visceral and emotional testimony, so that when she presents as traumatized in the ways that she's expected to as a victim, the prosecutor promotes those as examples that lend authenticity to her testimony, and then would be able to pose the question of whether a traumatized victim should be expected to give a tight, clear narrative, calm narration of the past. And it's against this backdrop then that the defense makes the moves that I've just described. Okay, on to Mary. So while Leah's case resulted in an almost immediate guilty verdict, Mary's unfolded in a different way. So Mary is an older victim and testifier. she presented, in a sense, the wrong kind of victim because she didn't break down on the stand. She maintained her composure. She spoke of the emotional aftermath of the assault this is by a former partner of her who's also the father of her young child, and for whom she has since become a home care health giver. I'll come back to that in a moment. But she referred to the emotional aftermath in the past tense, not evincing it on the stage, on the stand, not sort of exhibiting present trauma from this in the way that Leah did. They say, by being poised and in control of her testimony, Mary did not demonstrate sufficiently how sexual assault had transformed her and impacted her in the present. Again, this is one of the stereotypes that lead to jury expectations. There were other complicating factors in her case, like, as I said, the fact that she was had recently become the health caregiver for her former partner. That was the context in which the assault occurred. And defense counsel used this and their familiarity to suggest that, in fact, the sex had been consensual and perhaps even transactional on her side. In this case, the jury deliberated for quite a long time. They had to overcome a deadlock, but they returned a not guilty verdict. It's all right, hit the wrong key. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, so on to Maya, the final case. This is a case with a child. The double bind appears in a distinct way in Maya's case. So with child victims, the work of the prosecutors is to bring jury members into the world of the child. And they do this with this painstaking testimony on the stand to establish consistency and reliability in the child's storytelling. By contrast, the defense would often argue that children were capricious, imaginative liars who could be manipulated by others. To counter this, then, the prosecutor took care to elicit from Maya the difference between a truth and a lie, so that then, being able to describe this difference, the jury can place trust in what she has to say about her assaults. This is also a way, then, of being able to explain away concerns about detail in her story, details that seem not to line up, or that where she couldn't place them in a clear temporal sequence or something like this. Why? Because now the prosecutor is in a position to say the issue here is not with Maya's truthfulness. You can trust her word. The issue is that this is a case of a series of assaults over a period of time, and it's that repetitive nature of the assaults that leads to these questions of detail and things seeming to be out of sequence. Again, the jury took to this line of argumentation and very quickly returned with guilty verdicts on the various counts that the defendant faced. They conclude with this. They say, during our observations, when victims of sexual assault took the stand, they were part of a rhetorical and affective process of legal storytelling. The courtroom was a dialogical construction, a policing of rape victims' speech that unfolded for the purpose of inciting the spectacle of suffering. The courtroom was not a space for conversation among equals. It perpetuated discursive subordination and testimonial violence. So despite the differences in the content of the different testimonies and in the different cases, Attorneys used many of the same kinds of techniques to shape the narratives, relying heavily on common cultural understandings of rape, trauma, and memory, including that of the distraught feminized subject unable to speak the unspeakable events of rape without judicial assistance. And so this is the setting for what Hlavka and Mulla present as the policing and normalization of testimony and testifiers, in particular for adults, but with more flexibility for children. And this brings us to the end of chapter 2. Thank you.